Ashford Lake, Michigan. The dam that controlled the water level of Ashford Lake was built in 1931 by the County Water Authority as part of a flood management system covering the Lower Kessler River watershed, a concrete and steel structure 40 feet wide and 12 feet high that sat at the lake's southern outlet, operated by a system of hydraulic gates that could be opened or closed in fractions of an inch to manage the lake's level within a tolerance band that the authority had kept for 80 years between a summer high and a winter low that the 318 lakefront properties had been built to accommodate. The man who operated those gates for 31 years, a water authority engineer named Dale Cosgrove, understood the dam and its hydraulics better than anyone alive, and he understood the lake and its property values better than anyone in the county thought he did, and the investigation that finally reached him in the fall of 2022 would establish that for at least 19 of his 31 years, he had been using the first understanding as an instrument of the second, manipulating the lake's water level in ways invisible to the homeowners whose properties bordered it, in ways that produced flooding events or drought conditions that were damaging enough to suppress property values, but not dramatic enough to trigger the state-level dam safety review that would have caught what he was doing, and then, through a network of real estate proxies, that the investigation spent 8 months untangling, acquiring the damaged and undervalued properties for a fraction of their undisturbed worth. The investigation began with a flood. On the night of July the 14th, 2021, a water event of sufficient severity to inundate 11 lakefront properties on the north shore of Ashford Lake caused approximately $2.8 million in property damage, destroyed a dock that a family of 4 had been sitting on an hour before the event, and was blamed by Dale Cosgrove in his official post-event report to the Water Authority Board on an unusual precipitation event combined with an upstream obstruction that had temporarily restricted drainage before releasing a surge into the lake. The post-event report was thorough, technically detailed, and filed within 72 hours. The board found reassuring and that an independent structural engineer named Renata Hollis, hired by 3 of the flooded homeowners to assess the damage, found slightly too reassuring in the specific way that a document generated by a potential respondent in a property damage claim tends to be, comprehensive about what happened and about everything that could explain it, and noticeably brief about the gate operation logs in the 24 hours preceding the event. Renata Hollis had been retained to assess structural damage, not to investigate the dam's operations, but structural engineers who assess flood damage read operational logs the way physicians read vital signs, as part of a complete picture of causation and the gate operation records she requested from the Water Authority showed for the 24 hours before the flood a pattern of gate adjustments that she did not recognize as consistent with either standard flood management protocol or the upstream obstruction narrative in Cosgrove's report. The adjustments were small, each one within the normal range of routine operation, but their sequence, a series of incremental closings followed by a rapid opening series over a 12-hour window, produced a water accumulation and release pattern that her modeling showed was capable, in the precipitation conditions of July 14th, of contributing materially to the severity of the downstream event in a way that the precipitation event and the upstream obstruction alone were not. She put this finding in her structural assessment report, not as a conclusion about intent but as a technical observation about causation, phrased carefully and conditionally. The 3 homeowners who had hired her read the report and took it too. An attorney in Traverse City named Marcus Webb, who read it and filed a civil complaint against the Ashford County Water Authority in October of 2021, citing the gate operation records as evidence of potential operational negligence. The Water Authority's insurer, a regional municipal liability carrier named Great Lakes Public Risk received the complaint and assigned it to a claims investigator named Judith Park, who spent 3 weeks reviewing the dam's complete operational records going back 5 years and produced a memorandum for Great Lakes Public Risk's attorneys that the attorneys understood immediately and that they took, before the end of the week, directly to the Michigan Attorney General's office. Judith Park's memorandum did not make a fraud allegation. It made an actuarial one. She had reviewed 5 years of gate operation logs against precipitation records, the lake level records, and the property damage claims filed with the Water Authority and with private insurers for lakefront properties over the same period, and she had found a pattern that no actuary employed by a liability insurer could look at without immediate escalation. In 5 consecutive years, the properties that experienced damage from anomalous lake-level events were not distributed randomly around the lake. They were concentrated with a consistency that was statistically incompatible with random distribution on the North Shore, specifically in the segment of the North Shore where property values were highest and where, according to the property records she had cross-referenced, the most recent sales prices were the furthest below the waterfront property trend for comparable properties in the broader Kessler River watershed region. Not only was the damage concentrated in one area, the aftermath of each damage event showed the same pattern: distressed sales at prices below market to buyers who were, in 3 of the 5 years, entities whose identity the property records did not make immediately obvious. Judith Park did not know who owned those entities. She knew that they existed and that they appeared in the Ashford Lake property record with a consistency that was not explainable by coincidence. She gave the finding to the attorney gave it to the AG's office, and the AG's office opened a formal investigation in November of 2021, 4 months after the flood that had started everything. Dale Cosgrove, the Water Authority's chief hydraulic engineer, had held the position since 1991, appointed at the age of 32 after 8 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, where he had developed a technical expertise in dam hydraulics and watershed management that made him, at the time of his hiring, by a significant margin, the most qualified applicant for a job that was genuinely demanding and genuinely important, because the Kessler River watershed included, downstream of Ashford Lake, several communities whose flood safety depended on management of the dam's operation. He had been, by the Water Authority Board's assessment throughout his tenure, an exemplary technical employee, one of those rare specialists whose expertise is so complete and so specialized that the organization around him develops, over time, a dependence on that expertise that amounts to a kind of institutional faith, a faith whose practical effect is that the expert's work is reviewed for compliance with procedural requirements, but not for accuracy of judgment, because the expert is the standard against which judgment in the field is measured, and there is no higher standard available within the organization to apply to his. That faith, the investigation established, had been available to Dale Cosgrove from the first year of his employment and had been exploited by him carefully and incrementally, beginning in approximately 2003, a date the investigators fixed by cross-referencing the first anomalous damage with the property records and with Cosgrove's financial history, which showed, beginning in 2004, a series of deposits in amounts too large and too irregular to represent salary or investment income from any source visible in his tax returns, and too small and too well-timed to be coincidental. The scheme's mechanics, the gate operation logs, which the investigation examined going back to 2001, told the story with a technical precision that Cosgrove could not have anticipated would ever be read by someone who understood it the way Renata Hollis understood it. The logs showed, in the years before 2003, the ordinary operation of a well-maintained dam, the gate adjustments following the precipitation-driven patterns that Water Authority protocols specified, and 5-year average lake levels confirmed were consistent with good watershed management. Beginning in 2003, a second pattern began appearing alongside the ordinary pattern. Anyone reviewing the logs for protocol compliance, because each individual adjustment was within operational norms, but visible to the hydraulic modeling Renata Hollis and the state's own dam. Safety engineers performed during the investigation because the second pattern was designed to produce specific outcomes rather than to manage the watershed optimally. The second pattern worked in two modes. In the first mode, Cosgrove would make a series of incremental gate closings over a period of 3 to 5 days before a forecast precipitation event, closing slightly more than protocol required for the conditions, so that the lake entered the precipitation event with a water level marginally higher than it should have been. When the precipitation arrived, the water level rose higher and faster than it would have otherwise, producing flooding conditions on the North Shore properties that had been identified as acquisition target. In the second mode, operating in dry years, he would make a series of incremental gate openings below what optimal lake management required, drawing the lake level down over weeks into a range that produced dock groundings, boat access restrictions, and property access problems on the same targeted properties, damage that was less dramatic than flooding. But that was for a lake home purchased for recreational use, economically significant and in the hands of a real estate agent presenting the property to buyers. A compelling argument for a discounted price. Neither mode left a signature that was recognizable as fraud from inside the Water Authority, because both modes produced outcomes within the range of outcomes that a competently managed dam could produce in the relevant conditions. This signature was only visible when the outcomes were mapped against the property damage claims and the subsequent property sales, a map that nobody inside the authority was building and that the authority had no mechanism to require, because the authority's mandate was to manage the watershed, not to monitor its own engineer's relationship to the watershed's adjacent property market. Proxies. The investigation's most time-consuming phase was the identification of the entities that had been acquiring damaged North Shore properties, a process that took the better part of 8 months because the corporate structure was more elaborate than anything the investigators had encountered in a comparable property case constructed, as the forensic accountants eventually determined. Counsel that Cosgrove had been paying through a retainer going back to 2006. Retainer to an attorney in Grand Rapids whose practice specialized in entity formation and whose involvement in the scheme made him, eventually, a co-defendant. The structure consisted of 5 limited liability companies, each formed in a different year. Between 2004 and 2014, each registered in a different state, each with a different registered agent, and each acquiring properties in a different segment of the North Shore targeted area, so that no single entity showed a pattern of acquisition that a title search on any individual property would reveal as unusual. The 5 entities collectively held, at the time of the investigation, 23 properties on the North Shore of Ashford Lake, acquired at prices the forensic real estate analysis established were on average 41% below what comparable properties in the surrounding watershed area had sold for in the same years, a discount that the damage history of the acquired properties fully explain and that, taken alone, look like nothing more than a patient investor's willingness to buy properties that had experienced water events at the prices that water events produce. The beneficial owner of all 5 entities was a trust established in 2003 in the state of Delaware, whose trustee was a bank and whose beneficiary was listed in the trust documents as the Cosgrove Family Irrevocable Trust of 2003, whose terms provided that its assets would be distributed to Dale Cosgrove's 3 children upon the death of Dale Cosgrove and his wife, or upon the expiration of the trust's term in 2043, whichever came first. Dale Cosgrove had, in other words, built a real estate portfolio worth, at current market values, approximately $7.4 million, inside a trust structure designed to benefit his children, funded by a scheme that used his professional authority over a public dam to manufacture the conditions that made the portfolio acquirable at the prices he paid for it, and had done so over 19 years without the entity structure ever surfacing in any audit, tax filing, or public record that his employer had occasion to examine. The homeowners who sold. The investigation identified 31 households who had sold North Shore properties to one of the 5 Cosgrove entities between 2004 and 2021, and the victim outreach process AG's office undertook in the spring of 2020 to produce statements from 24 of them. The statements varied in their particulars and were consistent in their structure: a water event or a series of water level problems, a property that had become difficult to live in or to market, a sale that the seller had understood at the time as a reasonable response to a situation that the lake had produced, and a subsequent life that had been built on that understanding, which turned out to be wrong in a way that the AG's letter made precise, and that each family received differently depending on where they were now and how much of their financial and emotional architecture had been built on top of the foundation that the sale had laid. Some had reinvested the proceeds in other waterfront properties elsewhere in the watershed and had done well. Some had moved away from lakes entirely and described that decision as the thing they most regretted: the forfeiture of a relationship with a landscape that the damage and the sale and the years since had gradually persuaded them they didn't want anymore, a persuasion they now understood had been manufactured. One woman, a retired teacher named Grace Torrance, who had sold a property in 2009 after 2 consecutive years of dock flooding and mold remediation costs, described she felt upon reading the AG's letter as a specific and physical sensation in her chest, like a door opening inward in a room she had sealed, not because she had chosen not to think about the lake house, but because she had spent 13 years persuading herself successfully that she had been right to let it go, and that the persuasion had done what persuasion does, which was make the sealed room feel like it had always been the right shape, and that the ex letter had opened the door and shown her that the room behind it was larger than she had allowed herself to remember. The flood victims. The 11 households flooded on July 14, 2021, whose event had started the investigation, were in a different position from the households who had sold, because most of them had not sold and were still on the North Shore and had spent the 14 months between the flood and the arrest dealing with the ordinary aftermath of a serious property damage event, insurance claims, remediation contractors, the specific having your home be a project rather than a place you live for the better part of a year. When the arrest was announced, they were told, through their attorney Marcus Webb, that the gate operation record had contributed to the flood they had experienced, and they received this information, each of them, in the specific way that people receive the information that the worst thing that has happened to their home was not the weather and not an accident and not bad luck, but a decision made by a specific man at a specific keyboard, which is with an anger that is simpler and purer than the grief of loss because it has an object, and with a practical question that the anger immediately generates, which is what it is going to cost him. The answer to that question was still being calculated in the civil proceedings running parallel to the criminal case as of this account's compilation, but the criminal case itself had produced, by the time it was resolved, a sentencing that the victims described with varying degrees of satisfaction as commensurate with what the record showed. The arrest and charges. Dale Cosgrove was arrested in February of 2022, charged with 19 counts of criminal property damage through reckless use of public infrastructure, 47 counts of fraud in connection with the property acquisitions, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy in connection with the Grand Rapids attorney, whose role in forming and maintaining the entity structure had been established through his own retainer records and through a set of communications between him and Cosgrove that the search warrant produced from Cosgrove's home office computer communications in which the structure and its purpose were discussed with a directness that the lead prosecutor described as the kind of candor that people engaged in sustained fraud produce when they have been doing it for long enough that the precautions feel unnecessary and the risk feels theoretical. He was 63 years old. He had worked at the Ashford County Water Authority for 31 years. He had been given an award by the Michigan Association of Waterway Managers in 2017 for excellence in dam safety management. The award had a plaque. The plaque had been on his office wall. The investigation noted its presence in the evidence photograph of the office. The trial lasted 4 weeks in the fall of 2023 in Ashford County Circuit Court before a jury that the attorneys had spent 2.5 days selecting because both sides understood that a case involving technical hydraulic engineering and corporate trust structures and property law across 19 years required jurors who could hold complexity without resolving it prematurely into a simpler story. The prosecution's core strategy was to use Renata Hollis and to state dam safety engineers to establish the hydraulic evidence, a forensic accountant to establish the financial evidence, and a single homeowner from each of the 2 categories of victim, a seller and a fled victim, to establish what the evidence meant in human terms. The homeowner who testified for the seller category was a man named Robert Finch, who had sold a property in 2011 after 3 years of water level problems, and who had, in the 14 months between the arrest and the trial, spent significant time going through the gate operation logs that the investigation had made available to victims' counsel and had taught himself enough about hydraulic management to understand, without expert assistance, what the logs showed about his 3 bad years on the North Shore, which was that each of the 3 bad years had followed the same gate operation pattern, and that the pattern had ended the year after he sold, and that the North Shore property he had sold for $420,000 was currently assessed under the restored optimal management that the replacement engineer had been providing since Cosgrove's arrest at $690,000. He told the jury that he did not tell him he was right. The lake was. She did not tell him he was wrong. A difficult and unpredictable place, and that he now understood that the lake was not a difficult and unpredictable place, and that the only thing that had been difficult and unpredictable about it was the man who had been paid with public money to take care of it. The jury convicted on all counts after 7 hours of deliberation. Dale Cosgrove was sentenced to 26 years in Michigan State Prison. The Grand Rapids attorney, who had entered a cooperation agreement before trial, received a 4-year sentence and disbandment. The $7.4 million trust. The civil forfeiture proceedings targeted the Cosgrove family irrevocable trust's assets directly, and the case for forfeiture was complex because the trust was technically structured as a third-party beneficiary arrangement rather than a direct asset of the defendant, as structuring the Grand Rapids attorney had specifically designed to insulate the assets from personal judgment. The AG's forfeiture team argued that the structure was fraudulent in its inception, not a legitimate estate planning instrument, but a mechanism to conceal criminally derived proceeds. And the State Circuit Court agreed, voiding the trust structure and subjecting all 23 properties to forfeiture proceedings in a ruling that Cosgrove's criminal defense attorney described as broadly correct on the facts, and that the trust's lawyers, representing the interests of Cosgrove's children, appealed without success. The 23 properties were valued under the restored management conditions that Cosgrove's successor had established at approximately $7.4 million. The court's disposition order directed that 20 of the properties be offered first to the families from whom they had been acquired at the original distressed sale prices, adjusted for inflation, giving each family the option to reacquire their property at the price they had received for 13 or 12 or however many years ago. Before any open market sale was permitted, 11 families accepted. 9 declined for various reasons that included having long since built different lives elsewhere, having properties that could no longer be afforded even at the distressed prices, or simply not wanting to return to a place whose history had been fundamentally changed for them by the knowledge of what had been done there. The 3 remaining properties and the proceeds from the 9 declined offers went into a compensation fund for the flood victims of July 14, 2021. It was not enough to fully compensate them. It was a fund. It was dispersed. The civil proceedings for the remaining damages are continuing. Renata Hollis, the structural engineer who had found the gate operation pattern in the course of a routine damage assessment, has said, in the 2 years since the trial, that she thinks about the case every time she reviews a post-event engineering report filed by the responsible party whose infrastructure is at issue, which is a category of document she now reads with an attention she did not previously apply with full rigor, because the Cosgrove report had been technically sound in every detail she had been hired to check, and it was only because she had gone beyond the scope of her engagement out of professional habit to look at the operational logs that the pattern had been available to find. She now includes operational log review in her standard scope for post-event assessments, and she has recommended to the Michigan Association of Consulting Engineers that the same review be included as standard practice in any post-event assessment involving publicly operated hydraulic infrastructure. A recommendation the Assocation's technical committee is reviewing. She has also said, when asked whether she considers herself responsible in some sense for not having caught the pattern sooner, given that she worked in the relevant region and the pattern had been operating for 19 years, that she considers the question improperly framed, because her responsibility was to do what she was hired to do and what professional standards required her to do, and that the system that should have found the pattern sooner was not the private consulting market, but the Water Authority itself, whose board had approved 31 years of annual gate operation reports without ever commissioning an independent review of whether the operations were producing optimal outcomes for the watershed as a whole, a review that would have required someone to do what she had done in July of 2021, which was model the gate operations against the precipitation record and the lake level record and the adjacent property condition record simultaneously, and ask whether the model made sense. The Water Authority has since commissioned that review annually. The dam is now operated by a replacement engineer named Carol Manders, who has been in the position since March of 2022 and who submits her gate operation logs to an independent hydraulic review every 6 months, a review whose findings are published on the authority's website in a format accessible to any lakefront homeowner who wants to read them. Carol Manders has said that she finds the reviews existence appropriate without and not intrusive, and without and that particular moment of decision competently to set down and leave where they left them be nervous about in an independent review of her operations, which is correct, and which is why the review was put in place, because the person who would have been nervous about it is the person the review is designed to find. The lake. Ashford Lake in the summer, under optimal management, is the lake it was built to be. The water level in the summer band that the 318 properties were built to accommodate, the docks sitting where docks should sit, the boats launching where boats should launch, the North Shore properties showing, in 3 consecutive years of restored management, an appreciation in assessed value that the county assessor has described as consistent with the regional waterfront market from which the North Shore had been drifting for 2 decades. The people who sold their properties and received the option to reacquire them have each made their own calculation about whether the lake they would be returning to is the lake they left, and 11 of them have decided it is, or close enough, and 9 have decided it is not, or that the distance between who they were when they left and who they are now is too wide to make the return make sense, which are both reasonable conclusions about what a place means after the knowledge of what the place contained has changed the meaning of the place. The dam still stands. The gates still open and close. The hydraulic logs are still filed after every adjustment, the same logs that Dale Cosgrove filed for 19 years while adjusting the gates for reasons that the logs, read by someone who knew how to read them, eventually exposed. The logs are the record. The record is now read. The lake level is where it is supposed to be, in the band between the summer high and the winter low that 318 properties were built to accommodate, and the gates open and close to keep it there, as they were always supposed to, as they will, as long as the dam stands. And someone competent and honest is given the authority to operate it, and as long as someone independent is given the responsibility to check that the operation is what it claims to be, which is the difference in Ashford County as in every county that puts one person in charge of something that affects everyone between a system and the appearance of a system, between a gate that opens for the watershed and a gate that opens for the engineer, between water managed for the people who live beside it and water managed against them, quietly, in fractions of an inch for 19 years of adjustments that were each within norms and together a crime. The 11 families who came back. Of the 11 families who accepted the offer to reacquire their properties at the original distressed prices, the stories varied in their emotional texture but shared a practical architecture. A years-long absence from a lake they had logged, the administrative process of buying back something they had already once owned, and the specific experience of returning to a house that had been, in their absence, other people's house and before that the project of a man who had manufactured the conditions that made them leave it. Several of them described, in conversations with the victim services coordinator, the experience of the first night back as stranger than they had expected, not because the lake was wrong but because they were different and because the knowledge of what had been done there had changed the way the water looked in the evening light. At least for a while. Robert Finch, the homeowner who had testified at trial, was not one of the 11. He had declined the reacquisition offer, explaining to Marcus Webb's office that the property had become something he preferred to let belong to someone who could approach it without what he carried now, and that the right thing to do with the price differential between the $420,000 he had received and the minus $190,000 the property was currently worth was to let it go into the compensation fund rather than back into his own pocket, a decision the fund's administrator described as the most generous individual decision made in the case's entire resolution process. Finch did not describe it that way. He said he had done what was fair, which was a different thing from generous, and that the distinction mattered to him because he was not trying to be a better person than the situation required, just an accurate one. Grace Torrance, the retired teacher who had described the AG's letter as a door opening inward in a sealed room, also declined the reacquisition offer for a different reason. Now trying to close with she varying resources years and varying and urgency on the North Shore was a lake house that she had shared for 23 years with her late husband, who had died in 2016, 5 years after the sale, and whose death had been, in her assessment of her own life, the more complete loss of the two, and whose absence from the house made the house a different house from the one she had sold, regardless of what the dam operations record said about the conditions under which she had sold it. She asked the victim services coordinator in one of their conversations whether there was a category of compensation for the specific and quantifiable harm of having been pushed out of a place where a person you loved had been alive and being invited back to that place after the person was gone. The coordinator said there was not. Grace Torrance said she thought there should be, not necessarily as a legal category, but as an acknowledged fact that the Water Authority's record of Dale Cosgrove's 19 years of gate adjustments was a record of property damage and financial harm and also a record of something else, the disarrangement of people's relationship to the specific places where their lives had happened, a harm that the legal system could translate into dollars and could not translate into what it actually cost, which was a relationship with a landscape and a house and, in her case, with the years she had spent in that landscape in that house with that person, years that had been the ground of her life, and that the sale had closed a door on, and that the door had been closed by a man making adjustments in fractions of an inch to gates at a dam she had never thought about in 23 years of living beside the water it managed. She said all of this to the victim services coordinator in a tone that was not bitter and was not resigned, but was something more like accurate, which was the same word Finch had used, and which may be what people reach for when they have been given a precise and wanted education in the specific mechanics of how they were harmed and want to speak about that harm in terms that match the precision of the education. She was accurate about it. The record contains her statement, imprecise in the way all statements made in ordinary language are imprecise compared to the gate operation logs and the forensic accountant's reports, but accurate in the way that only personal testimony can be accurate about the thing the logs and reports cannot measure. The Water Authority Board, the 5-member board of the Ashford County Water Authority, which had governed the institution during the entire period of the scheme and had approved Dale Cosgrove's annual performance reviews, his compensation increases, and his gate operation reports without independent review for 19 years, was the subject of a separate state oversight inquiry conducted by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy in the months following their arrest. The inquiry found no evidence of board members' personal involvement in or knowledge of the scheme, findings that were plausible given the board's composition throughout the period, which consisted of county commissioners and public representatives with no hydraulic engineering background who had no mechanism to evaluate the technical content of what Cosgrove reported to them and no reason to commission an independent evaluation of an operation that had, for 31 years, never produced a significant regulatory violation. The inquiry did find and did recommend corrective action on the absence of any independent technical oversight mechanism for the dam's operations, the absence of a conflict of interest policy requiring financial disclosure by authority employees who had any interest in properties adjacent to the watershed they managed, and the absence of any requirement that post-event our EPORTS filed by authority personnel be reviewed by an independent engineer before acceptance by the board. The board adopted all 3 recommendations in resolutions passed at its first meeting after the inquiry's report was released, which was in February of 2023, and the Water Authority's operating charter was amended accordingly. The charter amendment on financial disclosure produced, in its first year of operation, 1. Disclosure that required remediation. A junior engineer on the authority's staff disclosed a partial interest in a lakefront rental property, a disclosure that triggered a recusal protocol rather than an investigation, resolved without incident, and representing exactly the kind of ordinary management that the policy was designed to produce rather than any suggestion of further wrongdoing. Carol Manders, the dam's current chief engineer, has never owned waterfront property and has said that she has no plans to acquire any, a statement she makes not,
and with a patience that
as a personal pledge, but as a description of her actual situation, which is that she manages a public resource interest for the people whose properties and lives depend on it, and that the responsibility of that management is not something she is prepared to compromise by acquiring a personal interest in its outcomes. She has said this to a reporter once when asked about it, and she has not been asked again because the statement was clear and complete, and because the reporter understood, reading the case file, that the statement was most precisely understood as the opposite of everything Dale Cosgrove had done for 19 years in the same chair. The case's technical legacy among the community of dam safety engineers and water resource managers who followed the case through the trade press. The Cosgrove prosecution produced a specific and pointed discussion about whether the technical signature of his gate manipulations, which had been identified retrospectively through hydraulic modeling, was identifiable prospectively, meaning whether a routine technical audit of a dam's operations would catch a similar pattern as it was happening rather than years afterward. The consensus that emerged from that discussion, formalized in a technical guidance document issued by the Association of State Dam Safety Officials in 2023, was that it was identifiable prospectively under two conditions: that the audit used precipitation-adjusted modeling rather than compliance review, and that the audit was conducted by a party with no organizational relationship to the dam operator. Conditions that are straightforward and inexpensive to satisfy, as the guidance document noted without dwelling on the implication, not standard practice in the majority of publicly operated dam systems in the United States. The guidance document estimated that adoption of the recommended audit standard across all state-regulated dam facilities would cost, in aggregate, approximately $40 million per year nationally, figure the document placed alongside the cost of the Cosgrove scheme's property damage and legal proceedings, which had exceeded $60 million in a single county over 19 years, without drawing a conclusion and without needing to, because the comparison drew its own conclusion for anyone who looked at both numbers. Which were the numbers? The guidance document was designed to make impossible to ignore. Michigan adopted the new standard for all state-regulated dam facilities in the spring of 2024. 16 other states had signaled intent to follow by the end of that year. The remaining states had not yet acted, which meant that the conditions that had allowed the Ashford County scheme to operate for 19 years were still present in various combinations in dam systems across the country, each of them operated by someone whose expertise was trusted, whose operations were reviewed for compliance but not for outcome, and whose personal interest in the adjacent property values had never been asked about and was not required to be disclosed. Most of those people are doing their jobs honestly because most people entrusted with public authority do their jobs honestly, which is the ordinary and unremarkable fact that makes the extraordinary and terrible exception possible, because the trust that allows the honest majority to function is the same trust that gives the dishonest minority the space to operate for 19 years before someone reads a log that was sitting in the record the whole time, waiting for the right question. The log is still filed after every gate adjustment at Ashford Lake. The log is reviewed quarterly by an independent engineer. The lake level is in the summer band. The North Shore properties are appreciating. The water is managed for the watershed. That is what the dam was built to do in 1931 and what it failed between 2003 and 2022 to fully do, and what it does now, what it will do for as long as the oversight holds, which is the only honest answer to the question of how long, which is not forever and not certainly, but longer than without it, and longer than the 19 years that the absence of it cost Ashford Lake, which is the specific and recoverable debt that the new standard was built to ensure is never paid again in this county or any county that reads the guidance document carefully and understands what it is for. What the lake sounded like. Several of the homeowners who gave statements to the investigation described and prompted a specific sensory memory connected to the properties they had sold, the sound of the lake at night, not the dramatic sound of weather or water events, but the ordinary sound of a calm lake in the dark, the small slap and withdrawal of water against shore, a sound they had heard through open windows for years and that had been, without their quite noticing, the background of the particular quality of rest that a lake house provides, a rest whose specific texture identity is built around, been able to reproduce elsewhere and had eventually stopped trying to reproduce, attributing its irreproducibility to the irreplaceability of a specific place rather than the loss of access to a specific place, not understanding until the investigation that those two explanations they felt the same from the inside were not the same from the outside, and that the distance between them was the distance between accepting the loss of a thing and understanding that the thing was taken. Grace Torrance said in her statement that she had not been able to sleep beside a lake since selling the property, had tried twice with rented cottages in subsequent summers and found that the sound, rather than being comforting, had become the opposite, not because the sound itself was wrong, but because her relationship to it had been changed, made self-conscious and precarious where it had previously been unconscious and stable, the way a habit that has been interrupted by an awareness of its own mechanics can never quite regain the fluency it had before the interruption. She said she did not expect to recover the ability to hear that sound the way she had heard it before 2011, and that this was, in its own small and specific way, a loss of the same kind as the larger once the case had documented, a loss of an ordinary pleasure, which is a category that legal damages do not accommodate, and that she was naming not as a complaint but as a record because she thought it was worth being in the record somewhere. The Victim Services Coordinator included Grace Torrance's statement in its entirety in the case's Victim Impact File. The statement is in the record. It will be there for the duration of the archive's retention, alongside the gate operation logs and the corporate trust documents and the forensic accountant's reports and the hydraulic models, and the plaque photograph and Renata Hollis's structural assessment, and the eggs letter that opened the door in the sealed room, all of it together in the place that records go when the case is closed and the appeals are exhausted and the people whose names are in the file go on with their lives, which is into the archive, which is where things are when they are finished and still present, preserved in the specific and formal way that official records preserve things, without sentiment, without decay, available to anyone who needs to consult them for as long as the archive exists, which in Michigan Circuit Court is a long time, long enough that the people whose names are in the file will be gone before the file is, which is the record's way of outlasting the event it contains and of being, after the event is over, the closest thing to permanence that the ordinary machinery of justice is able to produce. Ashford Lake is still there. The dam is still there. The water still moves through the gates in the amounts and at the times that optimal watershed management requires. The gate operation log for the most recent quarter shows 47 adjustments, each one within protocol, each one reviewed and confirmed by the Independent Engineers Quarterly Report, one filed in the authority's public record system where any homeowner on the North Shore or the South Shore or anywhere else around the lake who wants to understand what the water authority does with the dam that controls their water level can go and read what was done and when and why and confirm that the explanation makes sense. Most of them do not read it. Most people do not read the records of the public institutions that manage the physical conditions of their daily lives because the management is invisible when it is working correctly and the records are technical and the time it would take to understand them is time that most people spend on other things, which is reasonable. And which is the condition that makes the existence of independent review not optional. Because the independent reviewer is the person reading the record on behalf of the people who are not reading it, which is the mechanism that makes a public institution public in the meaningful sense rather than merely the formal one, and which is what Ashford County has now and did not have for 19 years, and which the lake cannot speak to and which the gate operation logs do not acknowledge and which the sound of water at night does not record, but which is nevertheless the thing that makes the difference in this county and in every county that sits beside a public resource managed by a trusted specialist between the lake being what it says it is and the lake being what it was for 19 years, which was the same lake with a different thing underneath it, adjusted in fractions of an inch by a man who understood the water and decided to use that understanding against the people who lived beside it for 19 years of quarterly reports that nobody read all the way through in a system that trusted its expert and forgot to check. The North Shore in October. Ashford Lake in October is a different lake from the summer lake, the recreational. Boats gone from the water, the docks pulled for the season, the deciduous trees. On the North Shore in the specific and temporary condition of maximum color before the leaves drop and the light coming low across the water in the afternoons, in a way that the people who live beside it year-round have a name for the October light, as though it is a distinct season rather than a quality of a season, which it is particular to this latitude and this water, and this particular angle of sun. Robert Finch, who did not reacquire his property, has driven past the North Shore in October twice since the trial ended, both times without stopping, both times looking at the properties from the road in the way that a person looks at a place they have decided to leave behind, which is with the knowledge that the looking is different from the staying, and the difference is the right one for where they are in their life. He has said to his wife that he does not miss the lake exactly. That what he misses is the thing the lake represented before he knew what was underneath it, which was the simplicity of a place that was simply a place, water and shore and October light, not managed against you, not adjusted in fractions of an inch by a man at a keyboard, just water, doing what water does, which is what it was always doing and what it is doing again now, and what he is willing to believe it will keep doing, even though he is no longer beside it to hear the sound it makes in the dark. Grace Torrance did not drive past the North Shore. She has not been back to Ashford County. She said in her last conversation with the Victim Services Coordinator that she thought the record was complete enough and that what remained to be done with what the record contained was not the coordinator's work but hers, and that she expected to do it slowly and in the ordinary way, which was not by returning to the place but by finding out over time what the knowledge of what had been done there settled into in the body of a person who has lived long enough to understand that some things change the shape of a memory without changing the memory itself, and that what she was working out, now that the case was closed and the record was filed and the letter had opened, the door would not close again, was not how to forget what she had learned, but how to carry it alongside what she already had, which was 23 years of a lake and a house and a man she had loved, and the specific sound of water at night that she had heard through an open window for all of those years, which belonged to her and which the record could not take and which Hector Cosgrove had not been able to take, which was the only part of it that remained fully hers, which she intended to keep, which she will keep, which is in the record too. Now, because she put it there, and because she thought it was worth naming. And she was right. The dam at Ashford Lake manages the water. The water is managed well. The North Shore properties hold their value. The gate operation logs are filed and reviewed. The independent engineer signs off each quarter. The lake in October has the October light. The record is complete and open. That is where this account ends, not with a verdict or a sentence, though those are in the record too, but with the water doing what the water was always supposed to do, in the light that October produces at this latitude, on a lake that the county built a dam to manage and that a man managed against the county for 19 years and that is now managed for it again, as it was intended to be managed, as it will be managed for as long as the oversight holds and the logs are read and someone independent is given the responsibility to check that the gate is opening for the watershed and not for the engineer. She stays for about an hour for the water dries home, and she does not is checking. The water level is in the summer band or the winter band, depending on the season, and the band is where it is supposed to be, and the fractions of an inch are accounted for, and the North Shore is what it has always been from the road, which is a row of houses beside a lake in a county in Michigan, lit by October, holding their ground. The water holds the light. The light is October. The record is open. The checking continues.